I'm a 32-year-old woman and a phlebotomist at a rural hospital. In case you are unfamiliar with phlebotomy, I'm someone who takes blood from patients and prepares it for various kinds of testing. Last year, I encountered an issue with a patient that I've never seen before or since. It's been hard to get off my mind, and I hope writing about it will help. I guess this is also a last-ditch effort in hoping that someone will believe me and help me understand what happened. I've worked at this hospital for 4 years after spending the previous 4 at a nursing home. I had a bit of a rough upbringing mixed with some drug use, actually part of what got me into this line of work. As I mentioned, my current hospital is deeply rural. There are about 15 miles of woods right out back. I used to spend my smoke breaks out there before all of this. I encountered this patient on the graveyard shift, also known as the overnight. I'm rarely booked on those, as phlebotomy is considered the less urgent sector of the hospital that usually doesn't require late nights, but we were lighter than usual on nurses back then. I was just sitting down when the CNO told me that we needed a draw in a 145. I remember feeling annoyed as I made my way towards the back of the hospital. Whoever had done their intake had put this patient at the very end of the hall, with about 20 empty rooms between them and our other bookings that night. It was off the rounds structure. A 145 was the only room with light under the door. I did my usual knock and announcement before walking in. This part was all captured in the hallway monitor, which I checked the next day. The moment I walked in, I nearly fell backward. A man had pulled the chair from the far corner of the room, near the window, right up to the doorway. He was sitting and facing the entrance and sprung to his feet the moment I walked in. A boy was lying on the bed behind him, and I could feel a breeze coming from outside. I distinctly remember that the man had on a ball cap that read Louisville in faded letters, and big black sunglasses that contrasted his sallow, droopy skin. He was wearing a shirt that also read Louisville, and he stepped back as I stepped forward, pushing the chair behind him with a scrape. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, quickly, shaking his head back and forth. I remember just laughing in response and telling him it was fine, that I was just used to the chair being in the corner. I turned for the patient chart tucked in the clipboard holder and found it missing. When I turned back, the man was holding it out for me and told me that he just finished filling it out. I took it with a nod, scanning the details, then walking over to the boy. It had been filled in with sloppy handwriting. I don't remember all the specifics of how I interacted with the boy, but I know I must have followed my usual procedures before a draw. I smiled down at him, and he stared up at me with watery, green eyes. He looked 12, the age his chart read. "Hi there, Louis," I remember saying, glancing for his name. I asked him how he felt today. The boy looked at the man, then back to me. I heard the scrape of the chair being pulled closer to the bed behind me. "I feel fine. But my father and I want to make sure that I'm all normal. So we came to try this." At that point, the father had his hands on the foot of the bed and was leaning forward, staring from beneath the thick sunglasses. "Of course, Louis. Well, I'm going to check that out by borrowing a little blood from you if that's all right. It really won't hurt at all." That is roughly what I responded. Suddenly, the man piped up, speaking quickly and loudly so that both Louis and I turned to him. "It won't hurt at all." The boy nodded in response and seemed to repeat it to himself. I felt myself begin to grow uneasy at the father's mannerisms as I made my way across the room to the medical cabinet. This unease was compounded by a gust from the open window, which chilled me in my scrubs. As I looked out the open window, I could see the tree line not too far away, and the branches swaying and clawing against the night sky. I remember that very distinctly. We never kept the windows open, so I moved to close it. As my hand stretched out, I could see the man standing stiffly behind me in the reflection from the glass. "Please, leave it open," he cooed. "We get very hot." I was tired, and the man was standing very close to me, so I acquiesced, turning back to the medical cabinet and opening it for my supplies. I grabbed what I needed and placed it on the sink counter, washing my hands as I routinely did and slipping on my gloves. I know that all the equipment I took was standard: butterfly needles, Vacutainer, collection, tubes, gauze, tourniquet, everything you'd expect. There was nothing faulty about the materials. I know that isn't what happened here. I walked up to the left side of the bed and asked Louis to sit up nice and straight. Normally I prefer using a nice, cushiony chair, but those are a bit down the hall, and we are already comfortable in bed, is what I told him, stupidly, instead of taking him to the drawer room. I remember things more vividly from here. I placed the collection tubes and needle down on the small table nearby and applied the tourniquet around his mid-bicep. He stared solemnly up at the ceiling as I began to thumb the crook of his arm for the vein. That's when I first knew something was wrong. As I stared down at the boy's arm and felt around with my fingers, I couldn't find the tracings of his veins anywhere. I pressed my thumb harder, squinting as if it would make the blue streaks appear beneath his skin. After nearly a minute, I started to feel confused. I smiled up at the boy, whose eyes held the same watery stare. I decided I'd best try my luck with a puncture. I drew my tools, wiping the crook of his arm with alcohol and aiming the needle in the same place I always did. I was hoping I was just tired. As I dug the needle in, I hoped for the momentary resistance and then gentle pop that accompanied the finding of a vein. But none came. "I'm sorry, I'm going to need to try again," I said, softly. It was what I always remark when I can't find the vein, though I rarely need to. I slid out the needle slowly, pressing a square of gauze against the area, before repuncturing. Again, I felt nothing. As this process continued for 6 failed puncture attempts, I began to notice a few things. The first, which I realized as I pushed in the needle for the 3rd time, my teeth gritted, was that the boy did not seem pained at any moment. It was like putting an 4 drip in an unconscious person. The second thing I noticed, while I withdrew the needle for the 5th time, was that the gauze I was pressing against the venipuncture sites was clean. I turned the white pad back to me and didn't see a single drop of red. As I looked at his arm, I could see the holes I'd made, but no spotting of blood. The third thing I noticed, after my 6th attempt was unsuccessful, was how close the man had gotten to me while I was trying to draw his son's blood. He was seated on the other side of a rather wide hospital bed, but he was stretching across it, leaning on his hands and craning his neck, his face only a foot from mine. I almost dropped the needle when I saw him, and it unnerved me even more than Levy's seeming lack of veins. "Something is wrong," the man breathed, and I moved my chair back to create some distance. I put down the needle and stood up, moving towards the foot of the bed. The man paralleled my movements, shooting up from his seat and standing in front of me with a few long strides. The man spoke in a hushed voice from beneath his cap and glasses. "Please, tell me what's wrong." He sounded nervous, in a genuine way, but it did nothing to reduce my unease. I whispered back, "I'm sorry, I just haven't seen this before. I'm searching for a vein to draw from, and I just can't find one." The man paused, his hands fidgeting. "What do you mean, exactly?" I let out a confused laugh, mostly out of discomfort. I remember wondering if there was a language barrier. "I mean, I can't find the vein." As in the blue tubes filled with blood in his arm. "I've never been unable to locate them like this. It's not normal." The man muttered, seeming to cock his head to the window behind me. "It's okay. I'll talk to him, he's just nervous." I shook my head back and forth, confused. I don't think he's nervous. In fact, most kids are a little scared of the pain, but Louis doesn't even seem to notice it. I'm worried something is wrong with him, maybe some kind of hypovolemia. His skin feels almost rubbery. The man began to shake his head back and forth, as if he were mimicking my motion. No. Pain and veins. He's all right. I will speak with him for just a second, and then you'll check again." The man was wringing his hands together now. The skin on them, like on his face, looked too wrinkled for his age. The man spun back towards the boy and took 3 long strides until he was at his side, muttering something. I looked over to the door and pictured the long stretch of hallway between myself and the rest of the people in the hospital. I considered who had done intake for the 2 of them, and if the man would even know what I meant if I asked for his insurance. I looked back out the window and wondered again, more intensely than I had the first time, why the glass and the screen were open. The man's voice cut into my thoughts. Okay. He is ready. The man was standing next to my chair, one hand tightly gripping the boy's shoulder. A thought came to me then that if I were to yank that hat and sunglasses off his face, the man would fall apart like that girl with the ribbon on her neck. The idea scared me. As I moved towards my chair, the man slinked behind it, holding the back of the seat. Looking at the both of them was starting to make me sick. One time, I saw a patient brought in who would clipped his knee against a rock while cliff diving, twisting his lower leg so badly his foot was facing backward. The wrongness of looking at that was what I felt while looking at the father and his son. I sat in the chair and just focused on the boy, hearing the man breathing heavily behind me. I drew a fresh needle for Louis and reached for him before my eyes widened. There, running up and down his arm, were thick blue veins. I gripped his elbow and could feel them pumping beneath the skin. They were undoubtedly there. I could hear the man's breath quickening, almost with excitement. I didn't know what to say. I wiped the area in the crook of the boy's arm and prepared the needle. Levi's skin felt moist, even through my gloves. I saw his face and neck, too, had droplets of perspiration. His skin was almost sticky now. I'm scared. Levi's voice came out like the croak of a frog. His big, watery eyes met mine. Some of his hair was clinging to his forehead from the sweat. I stopped moving the needle towards his arm and leaned forward. Louis, are you okay? Is something going on? Is what I responded. I could feel the man leaning over me. The boy nodded yes. I'm scared of the pain. From the needle. It won't hurt any more than last time, Louis. It's okay. I think that's how I reassured him, but I myself was confused. After that, Louis turned to look back towards the ceiling, his face going back to the stern grimace it had the entire time. I'd never seen such an inhuman reaction before. I didn't know what to do but proceed with drawing the blood. I aimed the needle right towards the bright, obvious veins, and dug it into his arm. I felt the pop of the vein almost instantly. I closed my eyes for a moment as the blood flowed from the needle into the first vial on the small table. I vividly imagined 20 minutes from now, when I was back down the hall, recanting what an odd experience my last draw was, and someone would commiserate with me that the graveyard shifts were always a mental strain. That's where I wanted to be. I opened my eyes and let out a gasp that barely avoided being a scream. What I saw was that the blood sliding from the needle, up the tubes, filling the first vial was a deep blue, the same color as the boy's veins. It looked like thick blue paint. I likely would have fallen backward out of my seat, if it didn't mean I'd fall into the man behind me, and the idea of touching him was worse than anything. What's wrong now? The man's was leaning down behind me, not far from my ear. His voice sounded harsher now than when he last asked this. Nothing. I remember stuttering out. I stopped the draw as it filled the first vial, sliding the needle out and wrapping gauze around the puncture point that began to stain blue. I knew I needed to get out of there. I picked up the vial and could hear the man moving behind me. The boy held his same zombie-like stare at the ceiling. As I stood up, the man was in front of me, between my path to the door. One of his hands was extended out to me. He was grinning, and I looked away from his teeth. I've replayed this interaction a lot of times in my head. Please, I said then. I don't know exactly why. Everything's normal with the boy, now? Yes. I sputtered out. I felt like I could hear movement from outside the window. Excited movement. Please, the man replied, grinning wider. I held out the vial, placing it into his palm from which the skin seemed to sag, and he moved out of my way. I almost ran towards the door, pulling it open as I felt tears begin to well in my eyes and then slamming it behind me. My leaving, as well, was captured on the camera. Asterisk. And that was that. I told the CNO and whoever was there at the time, nearly hysterical, that there was something horribly wrong in the room at the end of the hall, but it was empty once they'd reached it. I don't know exactly why any of it happened. I know people in here are probably more willing than most circles of the internet to believe this kind of crazy stuff. If anyone has any ideas, I'm open to hearing them. I haven't come up with any medical or logical prognosis. The last thing I should say is that since then, if I'm ever unfortunate enough to get the graveyard shift, I'm very careful. I make sure to lock all the windows before it gets dark, because I sometimes hear the ones in the empty rooms rattling from the outside. The cool breeze of the autumn night brushed against Lily's face as she linked arms with her new husband, Daniel. They had been married for just a few days, and tonight felt like a perfect time for a walk under the moonlight, away from the noise and hustle of the world. The gentle crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant hoot of an owl added to the serenity of the evening. Do you think this is the right path? Lily asked, her voice soft and full of wonder. Of course, Daniel replied with a smile, squeezing her hand reassuringly. I've been here before. The path leads to a small clearing where we can see the stars more clearly. They continued walking, their footsteps in sync, breathing in the crisp air. Everything felt perfect, too perfect, almost like a dream. As they walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in on them, their twisted branches forming a dark canopy overhead. The once soothing sounds of nature faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of Lily's neck stand on end. Daniel noticed the sudden change in her demeanor. Are you okay? Yeah, it's quiet. Too quiet. He nodded, feeling it too, but not wanting to alarm her. Maybe we're just getting closer to the clearing. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her breathing grew shallow, and she found herself glancing back over her shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, following them. Maybe we should turn back, she suggested, her voice tinged with unease. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. If you are not comfortable, we can go back. Just as they turned around, a low, almost inaudible whisper echoed through the trees. It was so faint that they could have imagined it, but the way it seemed to curl around them sent a chill down their spines. Did you hear that? Lily whispered, clutching Daniel's arm. He nodded, his face pale. Yeah, I did. They quickened their pace, the sense of unease growing with each step. The trees around them seemed to shift and sway, though there was no wind. Shadows danced at the edge of their vision, just out of reach of the moonlight. Suddenly, Daniel stopped dead in his tracks, causing Lily to nearly stumble. What is it? She asked, her voice trembling. Look, he said, pointing ahead. In the distance, barely visible through the thickening fog, was a figure. It stood completely still, almost blending into the darkness of the trees, but its presence was undeniable. A tall, lanky figure with unnaturally long limbs, its face obscured by the shadows. Who is that? Lily stammered, her heart pounding in her chest. Daniel shook his head, unable to answer. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching them. Let's go back, Lily urged, her voice rising in panic. But when they turned around, they found themselves face to face with the same figure, as if it had somehow moved without them noticing. Only now, it was closer. Much closer. Lily gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The figure's face was still hidden in darkness, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold and unblinking. Her chest tightened as she tried to scream, but no sound came out. Daniel grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. "Run!" he shouted. They bolted through the forest, their footsteps pounding against the ground. The trees seemed to close in around them, the branches scratching at their clothes and faces as they ran. The fog thickened, making it harder to see, but they didn't dare stop. Lily's lungs burned with every breath, and her legs felt like they were about to give out, but she kept running, driven by sheer terror. She could hear Daniel's ragged breathing beside her, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. But no matter how fast they ran, they couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was right behind them, its presence looming over them like a dark cloud. The air grew colder, and the shadows around them seemed to take on a life of their own, twisting and writhing in the corners of their vision. Lily's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she pushed herself to keep moving. She could feel her strength waning, but she couldn't stop. "Not now." "Daniel, where are we going?" she panted, her voice barely audible over the sound of their pounding footsteps. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice laced with fear. "Just keep going." Suddenly, they burst into the clearing Daniel had mentioned earlier. The sky above them was clear, the stars twinkling innocently, as if unaware of the terror unfolding below. But the sense of relief they felt was short-lived. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, its form more distinct now. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face was a void, a black hole where a face should be, drawing them in, suffocating them with its emptiness. Lily screamed, the sound tearing through the night, but the figure didn't flinch. It just stood there, its presence an overwhelming force, pulling at their very souls. Daniel stepped in front of Lily, shielding her with his body. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice wavered with fear. But the figure didn't move. It simply tilted its head, as if curious, and then, slowly, it raised one of its long, spindly arms and pointed at them. A cold, paralyzing fear washed over them, freezing them in place. They couldn't move, couldn't speak. All they could do was stare into the void where the figure's face should be, feeling their minds unraveling, their sanity slipping away. Lily felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she couldn't wipe it away. She couldn't even feel Daniel's hand in hers anymore. It was as if they were being pulled apart, their very essence being drained by the figure's presence. Just as she felt she could take no more, the figure suddenly vanished, leaving them standing alone in the clearing. The fog lifted, the air warmed, and the night returned to its peaceful state, as if nothing had happened. But the silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. It pressed down on them, suffocating them with its weight. "Lily?" Daniel's voice was a mere whisper, trembling with emotion. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered back, her voice shaking. "I don't know," he replied, pulling her into his arms. "I don't know." They stood there for what felt like an eternity, clinging to each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there were no answers, no explanations. Just the lingering fear that whatever they had encountered was still out there, watching, waiting. Finally, Daniel took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady himself. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice firm despite the fear that still gripped him. Lily nodded, her heart still racing. They turned and made their way back through the woods, moving quickly but cautiously, as if the figure might reappear at any moment. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch made them jump, their nerves on edge. But they didn't encounter the figure again. The walk back felt like an eternity, but eventually, they made it back to the edge of the woods, where the safety of their home awaited them. As they stepped through the front door, they both let out a breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. The warmth of the house enveloped them, but it did little to ease the fear that still lingered in their hearts. They sat down on the couch, still shaken, holding each other close as if afraid to let go. Neither of them spoke for a long time, the memory of the figure haunting their thoughts. Finally, Lily broke the silence. What do we do now? Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. We try to move on. But I don't think we'll ever forget this. And they didn't. The memory of that night stayed with them, lurking in the corners of their minds, a dark shadow that they could never quite escape. Every time they walked in the woods, every time they found themselves alone in the dark, the figure's presence loomed over them, a reminder of the terror they had faced. And as they lay in bed that night, holding each other close, they both knew that something had changed. The world no longer felt as safe, as familiar as it once had. Something dark and twisted lurked out there, waiting for them, and they could never be sure when it might return. But one thing was certain, they would never go for a night walk again.